First of all, I want to thank everybody for whoever sends the questions. It's always very good to receive some questions because they give some room for discussion, and hopefully with time we'll have more and more questions. I was asked to speak, and that was the beginning of my last week's lecture, or last week's discussion, on the halachic view on abortion, both general and individual, at least to give some bullet points, and also about contraceptive, which we didn't have a chance to speak last time, and I'm going to discuss it today, and as well as cover some of the questions that came through. And can you read out, Aaron, please, exactly the name of today's topic?
Yes. So today's topic, the question was as follows. Why is my contraception the rabbi's business? Meaning, why does the rabbi have to be involved at all in the idea of someone's personal contraception?
Right. So it wasn't actually a question that came through, but it's something we wanted to put out as a heading for tonight's discussion. Because it's not just, obviously we can't cover all the laws associated with contraception, but at the same time, I think one of the fundamental questions is, why is it that it's a question that would be asked of a rabbi? Isn't it a purely personal, private question of one's life? Why would it become a domain for a halachic discussion? As you would have already, those who came for all the previous discussions, you would already see that there isn't any part of our lives that isn't bound by the point of view, what's called the hashkafa of Jewish law. Jewish law is not something which is divisible, that we are Jews in a synagogue, on a Sabbath, or during prayers. But everything we do, how we eat, how we conduct our businesses, and yes, and how we, how intimate life and the life of procreation, of having children, all of these things is part and parcel of the greater ethics of the Jewish point of view on life. And when it comes to a question of having children, there are two main points. And I want to just, before I will continue with that, I want to say that it's a part of the culture of religious Jews that whenever there's a question on Jewish law, they will ask the question from a rabbi. And the reason why there's nothing embarrassing about it, because just like when a person has a question from a doctor, they would never think twice, how could I discuss certain intimate questions with my doctor? Because they realize they want to be healthy. And therefore, they know the doctor will only, when the doctor will discuss the particular question with them, he will look at it from a very technical point of view. There's no intimacy involved in it. And a similar thought applies to Jewish law. Members of the religious Jewish community, they want to make sure that they're not only physically healthy, but also spiritually healthy. And therefore, if they are in doubt about anything to do with Jewish law, they would ask a question. And the same way as a doctor would never even think about it from a very embarrassing and intimate point of view. It's a very technical medical situation. It's a very technical legal situation. And the question will be answered as such. And that is why none of these questions that we discuss are taboo. We talk about it very openly. And certainly, you know, I spend a very large part of my day answering questions from Australia and outside of Australia on Jewish law, which includes questions of family purity, questions on, and it could be also on all the technical subjects which we're talking about. And a very large part of it is the questions of contraception. And those questions are divided into three parts. Number one is when to take it, when it's appropriate to take it in Jewish law. Number two, for how long, and what method to use. Now, first of all, we have to know that even when the question is asked whether to use a contraception or not, we have to understand that the rabbi is not coming here to force anybody to do anything. Nobody's ever forced to have children. But the question is solely from the couple themselves. It's not that the rabbi comes along and says, look, you're going around asking people what they're doing, but the religious couples, they want to know when it's appropriate to take contraception, and also which form of contraception to take. Now, in the Torah, both written and oral, there are 613 commandments, biblical commandments. There's also some rabbinical commandments, but there's 613 biblical commandments. There are 365 negatives, what we can't do, what we're not allowed to do. For example, you can't break Shabbos, certain things you can't eat, who you can't marry. In altogether 365 negative commandments in all areas of Jewish life, and there are 248 positive commandments. From these positive commandments, there is one which is actually the very first one in the Torah, called Pru Urevu, to be fruitful and multiply, a mitzvah to have children. Interesting enough, from a very technical perspective, the mitzvah is incumbent upon the male, not the female. It's just a small technicality. The male alone can't do it. So a female is a necessary component of that mitzvah, but the actual obligation is on the man. And what exactly is the obligation of Pru Revu? And after a Talmudic discussion, the decision, the ultimate law is that it's one boy and one girl. So technically, when a couple has a boy and a girl, they have fulfilled the mitzvah of Pru Revu, the biblical commandment of being fruitful and multiply. Now, obviously, it's not something that always up to the couple to fulfill. There are unfortunately couples that struggle with infertility. There are couples who will have only girls, only boys, and nobody will hold them responsible and say, why did you not fulfill the obligation? But there is a reason why, and it's discussed in the Talmud and the codes, why the Torah defines the actual mitzvah, and it leaves up to the couple to try to do it, and ultimately God is the one that, like the Talmud says, Al Korach Chatachai, that we are not born, there's only one power that decides who's going to be born, and that's God himself. So nobody will be held responsible for not fulfilling the mitzvah if they did what they had to do, but that is the parameters of this particular mitzvah. On top of it, there is something else. The Talmud says there's an extension of the minimal obligation of Pru Revu, of the mitzvah to have the minimal amount of kids, and that obligation is derived from a biblical verse said by King Solomon, and the verse says, Al Tanach Yodecha, which basically means that Hashem entrusts us to be his partners to bring souls into the world. So there is a general obligation to have children. You would have noticed that usually, not always, but usually in religious circles, families are, on average, are larger. And that is the reason why, because they not satisfied with just having the minimal amount of boy and a girl, but they're always conscious of this particular idea, Al Tanach Yodecha, to continue this partnership. It's almost like a collective responsibility for our people. That the future of the Jewish people depends on, and not just on the Jewish people. It's something which the Bible says it's part of the responsibility of all humanity. But specifically for us, there was always this concept that we don't say, look, somebody else will do it for us. Somebody else will create the continuity of the Jewish people. There was always this feeling of responsibility that as long as we can do it according to Jewish law, without violating Jewish law, within the confines of the sacred rules of Jewish marriage, there is this responsibility to have children. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that it comes at all expense. I mentioned last time, even when it comes to abortion, always the life of a born human comes before of a potential life. And therefore, the halacha itself recognizes that together with having children, there's also a necessity to preserve health physical health and mental health. And as a result, there is an accepted ability to be able to take breaks and to be able to see what works for each individual family. There are certain reasons which are more legitimate to be able to space out and to have less children, and there are certain reasons are less legitimate. For example, what's considered in our mind less of a reason not to have children are financial thoughts. We are told in our holy books that since parnasa, financial success, comes from God himself, God needs to have a reason why to increase somebody's financial parameters, and therefore with every child, every single child is an extra, almost like a vessel, a spiritual vessel, to be able to have more parnasa. And that's why financial reasons are usually not a reason why we would limit the number of children, but certainly health, physical health, mental health, the stress levels of being able to look after a certain amount of kids and to be able to not to have too many kids one after the other. All of these things is enough of a reason. And therefore, the religious couples will come to a rabbi and sometimes not only would get permission, but very often they'll be encouraged that according to the law, it's better to be able to take a bit of a break and to be able to allow this extra benefit for the health, especially for the mother, who really is the main one that is affected by the man. She has to carry the children, she has to give birth to the children, and she also spends a lot of time looking after children. And therefore, especially the mother's help over here comes into the picture. And therefore, and also the same thing applies to if a couple already had a certain amount of children and they reach a certain age. The wife is already, she's coming to the age of 40 and she feels that she done enough of the collective responsibility for the Jewish people. She already has given quite a number of children, and she wants to be able to stop at this point because she realizes that after a certain time there is a higher possibility to have children with certain genetic issues, and therefore she said, look, I would like to take permanently to go on contraception. That's also something which the Torah would allow. And again, couples do take advice. The reason why they would ask a rabbi, because number one, there's a concept of conflict when a person's too close to himself, it's harder to make an impartial decision. And therefore, it's always good to ask advice from somebody else. And especially when it comes to the question of Jewish law, then people ask somebody who understands the parameters of what the Jewish law would say about it. I remember that it was quite a number of years ago, I received an email from a young lady, anonymous email, and she wrote to me. She apparently had a bit of a negative experience when it came to asking permission, after she had the first child, and that's what came across between the lines. And she asked me, it was almost like a cry for help. She was asking questions, was waiting for an answer to see if she's going to continue this particular communication. And she asked me two questions. She asked me, first of all, why is there, if a couple chooses not to have children, after they have a boy and a girl, why do they have to have any more children? And why do you have to ask a rabbi? And I wrote to her that it's easier to discuss it over the telephone. It's harder for me to engage in email communication. And here's my phone number. And she called me within 10 seconds after I sent the email. It was like almost immediate. And she spoke to me and she explained to me her frustration, how she lived in a different country. She came to Australia from a different community. And after having the first child, she asked for permission to take a break. She was given advice, which I'm not here to be able to judge on any other rabbi's decision or ruling, but I felt that it wasn't, there had to be more of a empathy to a personal situation, to be able to look into it and to be able to also advise her on a type of a contraception which is more reliable. And she became pregnant very quickly after the first child, and she gave birth to the second child. She felt overwhelmed, and that's what brought her to ask this question. So first of all, I told her that, we may disagree with the rabbi's decision, but to be angry, it's not healthy, because ultimately she had a child that she now can't imagine her life without this child. And therefore the healthiest thing is to understand that whatever ruling the rabbi gave her, right or wrong, but the fact she had this child is a present from God Almighty after it happens. And therefore, not to dwell on that. And I said to her, look, and I've given her the answer which I've given to just now, a few minutes ago. What is the reason why in Jewish culture a rabbi is asked? And why ultimately there is a concept of not being satisfied with having just 2 kids from a Jewish perspective, because of this partnership that God extends to us, that we can, He's looking for us, to bring our souls. He sort of created the world in the way, even though He can do whatever He wants. He could create clones, but He chose to create the world in such a way that a husband and a wife are His partners to bring souls into the world. And ultimately, we believe that every soul that comes brings the times of Mashiach, these utopian times which we're waiting for, closer, because a certain amount of souls have to come down into the world in order to bring Mashiach. On the other hand, I told her that I do agree that nobody should be forced, and everything has to be done in a way that a couple, and especially a woman, should feel she's doing it with love and doing it because she has chosen to have a child, not because somebody imposed this on her. And we had this conversation, and I must tell you that she continued. It's probably by now 8 years since this email. She since then moved away from Australia. She's still in touch with me. Since then, she had 2 kids on her own without being told that she has to do it. And she sort of became a person that asks questions because she wants to ask, not because she feels somebody is making her do it. And that's therefore it's one of the things that is so important is to be able to do it in the right way, to answer the questions, and especially of this nature. One of the things that I teach my students I have a institute for Dayanim, where the rabbis study to become Dayanim. One of the rabbis once told me, when a woman comes and says that she has some kind of a psychological issue, how do you know she's telling the truth? I said, one of the biggest foundations is that when a woman comes and asks you a question, you know she's telling the truth. You can't doubt her. She doesn't have to ask you altogether. Nobody would know whether she asked the rabbi or not. And therefore, the strongest principle is that you believe her 100% without any questions. You answer the question according to the way she asks you, without any doubt to the information that she's giving you. So this is the question of why and for what reason couples do come to rabbi to ask a question on contraception in general. That is the positive aspect of what I said before, the 2 aspects in our connection to God. There's negative commandments and positive commandments. So this is to do with the positive commandments. So technically, if a couple had a boy and a girl, and they are not having any more children, as long as they're using a kosher contraception, they're not violating a negative commandment. They're only not doing something positive. In other words, something which could be a very good thing to do. But ultimately, the negative commandments are in the realm of permitted and forbidden types and methods of contraception. When it comes to contraception, I won't give you now medical lessons. I'm going to give you a very, very short synopsis, and anybody who has any questions, you can afterwards ask me separately. There are basically 3 types, let's say 4 types of contraception. One of them, which is connected with male contraception, is not allowed in Jewish law. And this is basically the condom. And the reason why the condom is not allowed under normal circumstances, I'm going to give you a situation where a couple would be able to come and ask the question, but generally as a normal way of taking a break, it's not permitted, because there is a general prohibition in Jewish law of wasting the seed. It's called hashchosas zera, which we are forbidden to do. And even though wearing a condom, it's not the same prohibition as, for example, male masturbation for men, which is much worse. It's something which is, derived from the Bible itself. However, it's basically not considered to be a method which allows for the seed to flow in. And therefore, and I'm saying it very, very superficially, very shortly, very concisely, but that is the main reason why a condom is not permitted under normal circumstances. What I mean by normal circumstances? There are sometimes we do allow it. For example, when a couple is going through IVF, the most kosher way to collect the sample for IVF is a condom. It's a very different condom because it's not something which is used with chemicals and spermicides. It's solely used for collection. But nevertheless, this is the method which we recommend because out of all the other methods of collecting a sample for IUI, IVF, and so on and so forth, this is the best possible because it's the closest to having natural relations. There's also sometimes very rare situations where a woman has a certain condition where when sperm can actually bring on contractions and it can bring on labor. And sometimes it happens, I'm not going to go into this, there's also a very, unfortunately, a very big division between an advice that is a real advice from doctors, and sometimes it comes out of lack of understanding of a particular patient the doctors are dealing with. Sometimes doctors will just say, no relations for the whole of pregnancy. And to them, they making this decision very lightly because in their mind, what's the big deal? They don't understand that for a religious couple, it's a very big deal because if there's no relations at all, they're not allowed, the husband is not allowed to waste his sperm in any other way except with natural relations. He can't, so to speak, ejaculate outside. And sometimes the doctors will give this advice just because they think, look, let's be careful, and there's no real scientific substance behind this advice. But sometimes in rare cases it's true. Sometimes, in the case of a short cervix or a placenta previa or some other conditions, there is a potential danger that sperm can bring about a premature labor and contractions. And then the couple will come to a rabbi, and depending on the amount of time they would be abstinent, we could discuss as an exception to permit them to use a condom. But under normal circumstances, it's not a kosher form of contraception. The other three forms of contraception are the famous pills, hormonal, which are allowed in Jewish law, except sometimes there could be other problems with them. The amount of side effects they could have, if somebody takes pills and they have no side effects, they don't understand how lucky they are, because there could be a lot of side effects with hormonal pills. They could cause, they bring on depression for somebody that is predisposed to depression. They can also interfere with laws of family purity. It can bring on either spotting or breakthrough bleeding with certain types of methods. So while it's allowed, not always it's a preferred method. You have IUD, which has its own challenges, and then you have something called a diaphragm and spermicides. Diaphragm and spermicides is, on one hand, people ask, what's the difference between diaphragm and a condom? Diaphragm is also a barrier around the cervix, but it's very, very different because the barrier is not connected to the male factor, so to speak. It's around the cervix, and therefore it doesn't interfere with actual relationships, with the actual relationship, the intimate relationship, the way the actual traveling of the male sperm. So ultimately, depending on the situation, sometimes a couple will choose the method of hormonal method of pills. Sometimes they will choose more and more. We suggest a spermicide rather than a diaphragm because it's more user-friendly, it's easier to use, and it's also more reliable. Even though sometimes doctors don't know about it because they never studied it. And when a couple asks a doctor about spermicides, they will tell them, it's only about 80% reliable, which is not true because there are many different types of spermicides, and we know which ones are very reliable and which ones are not reliable at all. And many times the websites would just make a average at all of them and give a not a very accurate statistics of protection. But one thing which every couple has to know, there's no such a thing in the world as a foolproof contraception. Anybody that deals with it knows that's a fact, and once in a while we have a lady becoming pregnant on every single type of contraception without exception. I think the only possible contraception that is foolproof is abstinence. Apart from that, it's totally possible for Hashem to interfere and to say that, even though it's so unlikely, this particular contraception is 99% reliable, and nevertheless a woman becomes pregnant. I remember having a case with a couple that contacted me. They lived in a very small city somewhere in Central America. They were on a rabbinical post in that particular city, and they just got married, and they began the journey towards fertility. They suffered from infertility, unfortunately, and they came to me immediately, starting from before they even went to the doctor, which helps a lot because you can speed things up. A lot of times doctors will go to very invasive tests because they're not aware sometimes of certain realities of how, when religious couples, you have to find out when she ovulates, if she ovulates before the mikveh, and it's very, very easy to fix it. And sometimes they begin with more advanced testing rather than go to the basics and do things much faster. In most cases that I work with communities, whether in Australia or in America, I usually get to know the doctors, and we work together, which makes our ability to assist the couple much, much better and quicker. So with this particular couple, they went from different tests quite quickly until it came to the point where we had to make a sperm analysis, which we also do. There are different methods how to do it, but we do it in the most kosher way that the law allows it. And they found out that he was completely azoospermic, which means that there was no sperm in the ejaculate. And when this happens, ultimately, if there's even a little bit of sperm, then you can do what's called ICSI. That's the microinjection method, which we spoke about before. But if there's no sperm at all, then what is done is that a method called macrotessi, which means that it's a very invasive procedure, very, very aggressive procedure, where the surgeon goes into the testicle, he cuts it up, it takes out tissue, and he looks under microscope to find some cells. And the famous doctor in America is Dr. Schlegel in Cornell, with whom I work, and I work with the whole institution and also with him. And I sent the couple to him, and the doctor checked him out and said, yeah, he needs to go through macrotessi, and they've scheduled the procedure. A few weeks before the procedure, suddenly the wife is pregnant. First of all, they think it's a mistake. She gets checked a few times. She's pregnant. So they ask me both, how is it possible? I tell them it is possible, because when somebody is azoospermic, it doesn't mean that God can't make even one sperm go to the finishing line. We know that usually there's 100 million sperms or 50 million sperms that are ejaculated, and it's almost like an obstacle course. Hashem created humans different to many animals. With animals, it's like a no-miss situation. With humans, it could be a very complicated. If we would study the science of human reproduction, we'll see what a miracle every single pregnancy, every single birth is. There's so many obstacles to it. So the same way as Hashem makes out of 100 million, one achieve its goal, he can make even one sperm that at some point ejaculated also to achieve its goal. This couple had a child, and now she just now, a few weeks ago, had a second child. The same way as this was less than 1% chance of happening, same thing applies to every single form of contraception. With each and every one of them, when we prescribe one, it should be something in the 90s, something serious. Otherwise, it's not fair if you give very unreliable. But if it's something reliable, it's still not a it's not a full proof that it's not going to happen. What about a permanent contraception? So for men, we've spoken about, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I think we've discussed the question of vasectomy and explained the severity of it. Not only it's completely forbidden, but it's something that could actually tamper with the status of the male who performs vasectomy and his ability to marry or even to remain with his wife. We spoke about it and discussed the question of reversals and so on and so forth. So for this reason, it's a biblical prohibition and it's not allowed. What about for women to be able to tie the tubes, as they call it, or to cut the tubes? So that is something which is complicated. It's not easily allowed because a female sterilization is a rabbinical prohibition. It's not a biblical prohibition. It doesn't have the same effect as for male. And therefore, in certain situations of real illnesses and real danger to life, would allow it, but not regularly. For example, if a woman reaches the age of 40 and she has 5 children, she says, look, I want to be able to stop having kids, tying the tubes, it's not a legitimate type of contraception to look into, like I said before, unless there's very, very unusual circumstances. This is something else. Anything permanent can also make a person regret the decision in the long run. I recently, and this story happened just a few months ago, I received a call from a lady in America, somewhere on the East Coast, and she told me the following story. She says that she was giving birth to a 4th child, and she experienced a certain cardiac problem. And the doctor advised the family that for her it's better to tie her tubes, not to have any more children. And they've called a particular rabbi, and he says, yeah, if the doctor says you can tie the tubes. And she tied the tubes. Now she fully recovered, and she got a clean bill of health and full permission from all the doctors. She asked a whole concilium of doctors, said there's absolutely no danger for her to have another child. And she came to a point now where she's yearning to have another child. And she's really angry with that decision which was made sort of in a state of panic and instead of in a very rushed situation. And she was, first of all, she expressed anger. I told her, listen, everything happens for a reason. Again, I'm not discussing now. It is any rabbi who asks this question, he has to always be aware of the fact that it's whenever you give a permanent a ruling or advice for a permanent decision, you have to know that things change and situations change and people's emotions change. And while right now she's in a particular state of mind, it's not wise to prescribe something permanent. But at the same time, it's not healthy to have to be angry about something that happened you can't help. And she asked me whether she's permitted to try to do IVF, and I've advised against it because, again, IVF is a permitted method in the situations of infertility. She has, thank God, a nice family, 4 children. I must say that even with all of the biblical commandments of Pru Revu, be fruitful, multiply, and to be able to play this partnership with Hashem, there's no obligation whatsoever to go above and beyond and go to the methods such as IVF and so on and so forth. IVF is a heter. It's a permission that we give to be able to assist couples who are yearning to have children. There's no obligation whatsoever. Nobody can say that because we want to have more children, we're obligated to be able to go into what's called this assisted techniques. And certainly when somebody already has 4 children, it's not something which, again, I wouldn't forbid it, but it's not something which the Torah would advise. So this is the very, very general overview of types of contraception. Obviously, I covered this on a very, very basic level. I want to finish off by saying that from a mystical, philosophical perspective, God created a physical world for a purpose. He could have created a world of angels. And the purpose of physicality of this world is, and He gave us also ability to enjoy it. In other words, it's not, the Torah is not against having pleasure from the permitted things in this world. But the lesson behind the fact that we created not as souls, but as souls in bodies, is that there's a halachic application, there's a spiritual application to everything physical that we do. There's nothing outside of our connection to God. In other words, we eat not in our kitchens, not in our bedrooms, not in our business dealings. Everything that we do when we interact with other human beings and with God and with the world around us has a certain ethical aspect which we call halacha. And by adhering to halacha, we actually fulfill the will of God and help to make this physical world permeated by God's tangible presence. So this is the questions of contraception. We have some questions. One question was asked last week right at the end, and I promised to talk about it today. It was right before we finished. I was asked about HPV vaccine, which is basically a cervical cancer vaccine. And the question is an interesting question. Generally speaking, vaccines are advised in a situation of direct danger to contract a particular sickness. So in a situation of for example, a religious Jewish school or religious couple in a community that adheres to Jewish laws of the intimate life, how we conduct ourselves, and people who have only one partner, and so on and so forth, there's certainly no obligation to be able to. Vaccines that generally are not given indiscriminately. They're always given when there's a direct danger to contract a particular disease. So when they try to promote certain vaccines in schools, it wouldn't suit for example, a religious Jewish school, because to make it into a policy, it would send the wrong message. It would send a message that we are assuming that the general members of this particular school, they were leading a particular lifestyle. So if you're asking me, would it be advisable? Certainly when somebody is leading a lifestyle which is not in sync with the Torah point of view, both for Jews and for Gentiles alike, a person can still say, look, I want to be able to be safe, and there's nothing wrong, and it's only right to be able to take a vaccine to be able to help him. But again, to make it into a policy in societies and in schools where it's not a danger, it wouldn't be the right message to send to anybody. But at the same time, there's no prohibition for any, if you have a member of a religious Jewish community and he says, look, I would like to take this vaccine just because there's a slight a very unlikely situation where you could contract the virus even without any sexual promiscuity. A person has a right to do it. There's no prohibition against taking the vaccine. But again, there shouldn't be a policy, and it should be something we promote in schools and such. I hope this answers the question. I received this question on email, and it says as follows. It says, under the title Question, Message, Feedback. Dear Rabbi Ulman, thank you for your insight and for your insightful shir classes on fertility. I found your recent talk on Dar Yeshorim and carrier screening of particular interest. You have mentioned earlier that there are no bad questions, and so I hope you may keep that in mind with my questions below, please. Question number 1. I'm going to read first all of them, and then we'll answer them. Question number 1. Can someone who is of advanced maternal age have a child while undertaking a conversion program? Question number 2. If you were to meet your Jewish soulmate, bashert is like a soulmate in Yiddish, while you are in a conversion program, are you able to proceed and have a child with them and still continue your pathway to conversion? In brackets, as it would be planned that you would be married in the future anyway. And question number 3, can you still convert to Judaism while pregnant and within a conversion program? Many thanks and kind regards, and the name of the person who asked the question. So I will attempt to answer it to the best of my ability. Question number 1, can someone who is of advanced maternal age have a child while undertaking a conversion program? Now, as I mentioned in my class a few weeks ago, quite a significant proportion of candidates who come to convert are couples. For example, you have a Jewish man who met a non-Jewish woman, or vice versa. They either married and they decided now that intermarriage is not, they realize it's not something which they want from the life, and therefore they want to become religious and convert, or they are going out and they would like to convert before. For the lady, I'm taking one example, could be either way. Or sometimes you have a situation where you have a couple, both are non-Jewish by birth, and they both want to convert. So I'm specifically leaving out now single candidates because I'm going to cover this with the next question. So in these scenarios, we do accept the fact, we don't penalize anybody because the journey to Judaism began with meeting a Jewish man, for example. I mentioned before why it's acceptable in Beth Dins around the world, and I've gave halachic justification for it. The decision to have children, again, in a situation of a young couple, would advise them to wait until they would, after conversion and after they get married. However, if they make a decision, and sometimes they would even discuss the particular decision, for the reasons that the lady is already at the age, social age and fertility age are two different languages. You could be very young in all aspects of life. When it comes to fertility, it's a different, we use a different language. Already a lady who's, for example, 38 years old, right? Today, it's considered to be a very young age. But in fertility jargon, it's already considered to be already on a decline. So sometimes you have a situation where a couple really is worried that they don't want to, they may not be able to have children later. And we cannot, sometimes we are able to speed up the conversion program because of it. If it's possible, not always it's possible. If we feel that the couple is not ready, and I say couple because it's a package deal. They both have to make the effort. It's not just one. It's not the one who's converting. It's the partner also. Sometimes it's impossible to speed up the program because it's just not ready. At the same time, we understand that we will respect and accept the fact that they may want to be able to have children, not to lose the chance, and then will convert the children afterwards. I was asked a question, and this actually happened in Sydney a couple of times. What happens if the woman will freeze the eggs prior to conversion, and after she converts, she will use those eggs with IVF and transfer an embryo? We actually had an interesting case in America that I dealt with, and I also wrote about because I received a question from Rabbi Reisman, who was very involved with all the questions to do with Judaism and those questions that we're discussing over here. And he asked me this question about what happens if the eggs were frozen while the woman, before she converted, and then she used them after she was converted. We actually had this case that I dealt with in America. There was a young lady who converted. She froze her eggs because she had to go through chemotherapy. And afterwards, she converted, and she transferred the embryo. She was able to use the husband's sperm with the eggs, and she was able to transfer the embryo. And we helped to convert the child. There was no problem at all. There was no. We spoke about it in a few lessons earlier about the polemic what actually creates motherhood halachically. In other words, to whom the child is connected, to the genetic mother or to the birth mother. So the same way as if you would have an egg donor who's not Jewish, the same way if the egg was taken out before that, then there are opinions, logical opinions, which have place in the Jewish sources, that the egg retains an independent status once it's taken out, and therefore, once you use it, even though the owner of the egg converted since then, but because the egg became a separate entity to her, now you have to be able to convert the child. And that's what happened in Sydney also. We had one of our candidates for conversion that she froze her eggs before she converted, and afterwards she went through IVF, halachic IVF, and we converted the child. So this answers the first question, if we would allow somebody who's advanced age to have a child while undertaking conversion program. Question number 2, but we would like if the discussion would take place with us, because then we'll be able sometimes to give advice which will make it easy afterwards. Question number 2, if you were to meet your Jewish soulmate Bashert while you are in a conversion program, are you able to proceed and have a child with them and still continue your path with the conversion, as it will be planned that you will be married in the future anyway? There is a difference between somebody who comes with a partner and somebody who comes alone. When somebody comes with a partner, we treat it as a couple, and we allow the process to go through, and all of the things I mentioned before, the decision to have kids before, after, it all takes part as part of the conversion program. However, if we have single candidates, whether a boy or a girl, we don't want them to be able to date while they're on the program. It's something which completely interferes with the program both ways, whether they date a Jewish boy or girl, or whether they date a non-Jewish one. And therefore, they undertake, when they enter the program, not to date. Obviously, the challenge of a single candidate, sometimes people say, but single candidates, they look more sincere because they come without any, the journey to Judaism was so purely for its own sake. There was no connection to a partner, to a boyfriend, to a girlfriend, to a wife, to a husband. It's true that sometimes there's a certain level of sincerity that is very obvious when it comes to a person who comes on their own. But there's also a greater test, because at least when it's a couple, everything's cut out for them. They know that as soon as they will finish the conversion, they're going to be married, and it's going to be family unions, and we're very secure that it's going to be a religious Jewish family. But for a single candidate, there's always this particular challenge, the living in a society where people date anybody, and there's certain type of accepted behavior which is not conducive and not in sync with the commitments which they are taking to become an observant Jewish man or a woman. And therefore, once they convert, we encourage them to date and to get married, everything else, but they already know that they're limited to the people with the same lifestyle as them. So they have to not only date a Jewish young man or young lady, depending who they are, but also somebody who is also living in the same, committed to the same lifestyle as they are. So therefore, when it comes to a single candidate, it could seriously jeopardize the conversion process. And question number 3, can you still convert to Judaism while pregnant and within a conversion program? 100%. And we convert many times pregnant women. We spoke about it actually in the lesson about conversion, about what is the rationale of how does a unborn child becomes converted through the Mikveh, the immersion of the mother. I mentioned this not in great depth, but I spoke about it. And it certainly is a very, very common phenomenon that a woman completes her preparation for conversion while she's pregnant. And we don't say, wait until you have the child. She can convert then. The child will, in many ways, have a status of a convert, which is only will affect them in the sense that if it's a girl, she cannot marry a Kohen. But as we know that in Judaism, converts are treated as equal members of our community, and we even have special blessings in the prayer dedicated to righteous converts. So this was the question on conversion. And then I've received, I saw on YouTube, there was a discussion, something which I mentioned almost by the way in my conversion class. I will ask Aaron to read this question from YouTube.
Sure. So it was on the, I believe the second episode, or the fourth episode, where you discussed conversions. And someone said like this: because it's not currently possible to bring a sacrifice without a temple, so you offer two alternatives. One, that the converts are exempt from bringing a sacrifice, or two, that their obligation of bringing a sacrifice will be postponed until Mashiach comes. But could there be another? Could it be that according to Halacha, the converts, since the destruction of the second temple, are not truly converted? Just a thought.
So I enjoy the question very much. It's a very sort of learned question, which there's a lot of discussion, post-Talmudic discussion on this particular question. It's based on something which I mentioned in my in that particular lecture, that even though acceptance of commandments is the basis of the whole conversion, but the three things that actually, three mechanisms that are necessary for conversion is three for men and two for women. For men, it's circumcision, immersion, and bringing a sacrifice in a temple. And for women, obviously, two except for the circumcision. And I mentioned, almost by the way, because I didn't dwell on it, it's not something which is relevant in our times. It's hopefully it will be very soon when the temple is rebuilt, but it's not relevant for today. The question whether or not the sacrifice is something that will have to be done later, or the fact that you can't bring it today means that you don't have to bring it later on. And the questioner asks a third possibility. Maybe it means that the fact we can bring it, the conversion is not complete. This particular discussion is spoken about at length by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who has very, very deep talks where he discusses different subjects of Jewish law and mysticism and Kabbalah, all from all different areas of Jewish law. And he talks about specifically the subject. And he brings a whole discussion about it and different opinions. And the conclusion that he comes to is that even though it's true that according to Halacha, a convert will have to bring a sacrifice when Mashiach, when the temple is rebuilt, but it doesn't take away even an iota of his belonging to Jewish people and being a Jew. In other words, the korban is an extra special thanks to the Almighty that will be done when possible, but will not take away at all from the Jewishness of the convert today.
All right, thank you. So we have a few follow-up questions. Not follow-up. We have a few questions from today's lecture. Number one, we know that a man is forbidden to wear a condom since it is considered wasting seed. How is spermicide any different, since it also kills seed and stops fertilization? Right.
So first of all, I want to explain that the concept of spilling seed and wasting seed in Jewish law has nothing to do with having children. For example, there's no prohibition whatsoever to have relations when a woman is pregnant, when a woman at a time when she cannot have children, when a time when she's already past menopause. It's absolutely no connection with spilling seed. In other words, spilling seed and having kids are two separate things. And therefore, the only method which is considered to be similar to it, again, like I said before, it's not as severe a prohibition as actually spilling seed with one's hand for men. However, it's only a prohibition with contraception when it becomes a direct barrier, and it doesn't matter whether it's a male or female condom, but when it prevents the natural flow of semen into the vaginal canal. That is a definition of a relations with a forbidden form of contraception. Anything which is considered to be normal relations, but later on at some point there's a barrier, for example, a diaphragm which is a barrier right next to the cervix, or a spermicide which also allows for the sperm to go its way, and just before it gets to the cervix it destroys it. That's not considered to be wasting seed.
Okay, next question. If male hormonal contraception became available, would that be allowed?
It is already beginning to be available, and that's something which we, for the same reason, when it comes to a male taking it, we would not allow it.
Okay, next question. Under what circumstances is family planning an option? Like, for example, as someone starting a new job, can that be a reason enough to hold off on getting pregnant?
Okay, again, it's a difficult question because it's not a black and white question. On one hand, nobody's going to force somebody to have a child if at the time they feel particularly stressed and they feel that right now it's going to really upset them to do so. But it's a question of outlook on life. We are trained, on one hand, to put health and mental, physical health as a priority, and therefore there were times when I actually would tell a couple without even being asked that it's a good idea to be able to hold off and to create greater spacing to allow the woman the peace of mind, to both physical rest and mental rest, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to any of these things, that's a very legitimate thing. When it comes to a question of a job, ultimately, the reason why it's not correct in Judaism because it's not true. We believe it wouldn't interfere with the job, because we believe that ultimately God will not jeopardize our physical and material sustenance on that level. So it's a very delicate balance. It's not a question of a prohibition not to have kids, because like I said before, there's no prohibition. Once you want to put something on hold, and it's not a negative prohibition, it's more of a positive commandment you're not fulfilling. But if a person would ask a question and say, is that the right attitude? The right answer would be to try to set the mindset not to think that it's going to interfere with the job.
Thank you. And the final question for tonight is as follows. What if a school adheres to religious Orthodox standards, but the student body is mixed? Many are modern Orthodox, others are traditional, and there are those who are not religious at all. What would you say to sex ed in such schools, contraception in particular, so that those girls who choose to be in relationships, and there are such girls in these schools, will be educated and make informed decisions? Curious about your thoughts. Thank you.
I think that it should become more individual. Because, again, if you make it into a policy to be able to teach it publicly in such a school, I'm not discussing every single school, but a particular school was described with a particular ethos. And so I'm not suggesting we should be blind to anything that happens, but I think there should be more individual communication rather than to make it on a class level.
Okay, so there are a few more questions and we're going to save them for next week. I'm going to save these questions and we will address them in next week's lecture.
I just want to say that according to the plan, we'll go to a different topics now from these ones, from the ones we spoke about in the last couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to discuss the end-of-life issues, questions of when you're allowed to pull the plug, what you have to give a dying patient, when you don't have to give the dying patient in order to make them survive. And in 2 weeks' time, which I believe will be the 7th of July, I'm going to do something different. We're going to have a very special guest on our Zoom program. We're going to have a very close friend of mine who's a famous doctor and also a expert on halachic medical ethics. His name is Professor Avram Steinberg, author of many different books, including the famous Medical Encyclopedia, and he will talk about organ donation, whether something which we're involved with here in Sydney, how and when and under what circumstances can, or if at all, can a Jewish religious person be a organ donor, can sign up to be, and we'll talk about it in 2 weeks' time, and next week we'll do a Hakdama, a preface to it, by starting to talk about the question of end of life. So until such time, I want to wish everybody a very good week, and God bless all of you. All the very best.